I stood before a kneeling congregation of 300 Christians and screamed that their prayers were useless, that their God could not hear a single word they whispered, convinced that no prayer offered to Jesus would ever reach heaven. But the moment I grabbed the priest by his robe and tried to drag him from the altar, something happened to my body that made every person in that building fall silent. Have you ever been so sure that your prayers were reaching God that you never once stopped to ask whether something you say every single morning might be the very thing keeping him from hearing you? My name is Zaid Karim Sabah. I am 29 years old, and on January 18th, 2023, I led 5 men into St. Peter's Coptic Cathedral in Mansoura, Egypt, during their Thursday evening prayer service, with one purpose: to silence their worship and prove that prayers to Jesus were nothing more than words spoken into empty air. I had no idea that Jesus himself was about to reveal to me the one phrase that blocks God from hearing prayers, and that this single truth would destroy everything I believed about how God listens. I grew up in the Talha district of Mansoura, in a crowded neighborhood where the narrow streets smelled of fried falafel and diesel exhaust, and the call to prayer reached every corner 5 times a day. My father, Sheikh Karim Adil Al-Sabbagh, was a prayer leader at the local mosque, known across the district for the beauty of his Quran recitation. My mother, Zaid, wore full hijab and taught young girls how to perform salah in a small room attached to the mosque. Our home sat directly across from the mosque's main entrance. The adhan was as constant in my childhood as breathing. Islam was not something we practiced, it was everything we were. While other boys played football between parked cars or spent afternoons at the internet cafe, I sat on the cool tile of the mosque memorizing surahs. By 15, I had memorized the entire Quran. My father wept the day I finished. The elders said, "Allah has blessed your parents with a special son." I never missed a single prayer, not even when I was so sick I could barely stand. During Ramadan, I fasted without complaint and added voluntary fasts on Mondays and Thursdays. Prayer was not a duty for me, it was the center of my life. But my father also taught me something that would shape the next decade of my life. He taught me that Christian prayers were an abomination. He said that every time a Christian prayed to Jesus, they committed shirk, the unforgivable sin of directing worship to a created being instead of Allah alone. He told me that Christian churches were houses where false prayers echoed off dead walls and reached no one. In our neighborhood, disrupting Christian prayer meetings was considered a righteous act. By the time I was 18, I had joined a group of young men who made it their mission to challenge Christian worship wherever they found it. We stood outside churches during services, reciting the Quran through loudspeakers. We distributed pamphlets explaining why Christian prayer was invalid. We confronted missionaries on the street. I believed I was protecting the purity of true worship. By 27, I had earned my degree in business administration from Mansoura University. I was working at a logistics company with a good salary and growing respect. I was engaged to a devout woman named Yasmin, whose family were well known in the local Islamic community. I had everything a faithful Muslim man could want: money, status, a future wife who shared my faith, a direct line to God through my 5 daily prayers. I had no idea that the prayers I was so proud of were about to be exposed as something far less than I imagined. Ask yourself this question: have you ever built your entire life on something you were completely sure would never break? It started with a conversation I overheard at a family gathering. My uncle was talking about a Coptic church in Mansoura that had started holding public prayer nights. He said Christians in the neighborhood were gathering by the hundreds, praying out loud with their windows open, and that the sound of their worship was drifting into Muslim homes. He said it with disgust. But what angered me most was what my cousin added. He said, they actually believe God hears them. They believe their prayers in the name of Isa have power. The idea made my blood hot, the arrogance of it. That these people, these polytheists who prayed to a man they called God, actually believed their prayers were being heard, while the prayers of faithful Muslims were somehow no different. Someone needed to walk into their prayer service and show them that their worship was powerless, that their God could not protect them, that their prayers reached nothing but a ceiling. I volunteered that same evening. I had no idea that the Jesus I planned to silence was preparing to reveal something about prayer so shocking that my entire understanding of how God listens would be destroyed in a single night. I gathered 5 men. Tarek was my closest friend who had stood beside me at every protest since we were teenagers. Faisal was a seminary student who could recite volumes of Islamic commentary from memory. Bassam was a quiet mechanic who never questioned an order. Munir was the youngest at 21, eager to prove himself. And Walid was my cousin, who first told me about the church's prayers. Our target was St. Peter's Coptic Cathedral, the largest church in Mansoura. We chose a Thursday evening when they held their extended prayer service. Tarek attended one meeting alone and mapped the layout. Our plan was simple. I would confront the priests at the altar and declare their prayers invalid, while the others blocked the exits. I prayed tahajjud at 3 in the morning, pressing my forehead to the floor and asking Allah for strength. But something was wrong. As I knelt in the darkness, I felt a heaviness on my chest I could not explain. A pressure like an invisible hand pushing down on me. My heart raced. My palms were wet. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself Shaitan was trying to weaken my resolve. I barely slept. Have you ever been so convinced you were defending truth that you never questioned whether your own prayers might be the ones going unheard? We arrived at St. Peter's at exactly 7:45 in the evening. The January air was cool and damp. The church was built of pale stone with a large wooden cross above the entrance and arched windows that glowed warm from inside. People were still entering, families, elderly women in black dresses, young fathers carrying children on their shoulders. A man at the door nodded and said, "Welcome, brothers, come pray with us." His kindness made me uncomfortable. He had no idea why we had come. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of incense and melting candle wax. Golden light filled the space from hundreds of candles burning along the walls. Icons painted in deep red and blue and gold watched from every surface. Wooden pews stretched toward an altar covered in white cloth. The congregation was already praying, not sitting, kneeling. Hundreds of people on their knees, with their hands raised and their eyes closed, praying aloud in a sound that filled the building like a wave. Some were weeping, some were whispering, some were silent with tears running down their faces. There was a power in that room that I did not expect, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the incense. It reminded me uncomfortably of the most sacred moments I had experienced during the last 10 nights of Ramadan. I pushed the feeling down and focused on my anger. I gave Tariq the signal, a nod. The 5 men moved to their positions near the exits. I walked straight down the center aisle toward the altar. The people kneeling closest to me opened their eyes as I passed. Some looked startled, others simply continued praying. I reached the front. The priest was an elderly man with a long gray beard and gentle eyes. He was kneeling behind the altar with his hands raised, leading the congregation in prayer. I grabbed the collar of his robe and pulled him upward. The fabric tore. The congregation gasped. Women pulled their children close. "Your prayers are lies," I shouted. Your God cannot hear you. You pray to a dead man. My voice echoed off the stone walls, but no one stood to fight. No one screamed back. Instead, the strangest thing happened. People continued to pray. Some began to pray louder. Others knelt deeper, pressing their foreheads to the floor. The priest, whose robe I still gripped in my fist, looked directly into my eyes and said something in a voice so calm it felt like it came from another world. Jesus loves you, brother. He died for your sins, just as he died for mine. And he hears every prayer, even the ones you do not know how to speak. His peace made me furious. I wanted resistance. I wanted anger. Their quiet faith was more disarming than any fist. I raised my hand to strike him. That is when it happened. The moment that changed everything I believed about God. The instant my hand rose above my shoulder, I felt heat explode in my chest. Not pain, not burning, a heat that felt alive, like a fire with a heartbeat. It spread from my chest into my arms, my hands, my legs, my face. My raised hand froze in the air. I could not lower it. I could not close my fist. My entire body locked in place as if someone had poured concrete into my veins. Then the light came. It did not come from the candles. It came from inside the air itself, golden and thick and alive. The room around me dissolved. The sounds of praying faded, and I was standing in a space that had no walls, no floor, no ceiling, only light. And in the center of that light stood Jesus. Not a painting, not an icon, a living person made of warmth and authority and a love so heavy it pressed me to the ground before I understood what was happening. He looked at me with eyes that held no anger, only sorrow and love. A love so specific and so complete that it felt like it had been made for me alone. Then he spoke, not through the air, through my entire being. He said, "Every morning you wake and the first words from your mouth are words of complaint. You say, I am tired. You say, this life is hard. You say, nothing ever changes. And with those words, you declare that I am not enough. You agree with the voice of the enemy before you ever speak to me. That is the one thing that blocks your prayers. Not your sin, not your past, not your weakness. It is the agreement you make with despair before you make an agreement with me. Every morning you choose whose report you will believe before your feet touch the floor. And every morning millions of my own children open their mouths and speak death over their day before they ever speak my name." He was not angry when he said this. He was grieving, like a father watching his children drink poison, thinking it was water. Then he showed me something. I saw people waking up all over the world, Christians, Muslims, people of every background, and the first words out of their mouths were not prayer, not gratitude, not worship. They were complaints, murmuring, fear, frustration. And with every word, I saw something I cannot fully describe. I saw a barrier forming, like a glass wall between their mouths and heaven, not placed by God, placed by their own words. And on the other side of that barrier, I saw Jesus, standing, waiting, reaching, unable to respond not because he lacked power, but because their own mouths had agreed with the enemy's narrative before they ever invited him into their morning. He looked at me and said, "The prayer I hear is not the one spoken with the most perfect words. It is the one spoken by a mouth that first chooses to agree with me. Before you ask me for anything, tell me who I am. Before you bring me your problems, bring me your praise. Not because I need it, because praise is the key that unlocks the door your complaints have shut." My knees buckled. I collapsed onto the marble floor of the church. The Bible of light vanished. I was back in St. Peter's, lying on the cold stone with tears streaming down my face faster than I could breathe. I was crying harder than I had ever cried in my entire life. Not from shame alone, from the overwhelming realization that I had spent 29 years praying 5 times a day and had never once understood how God actually listens. I had no idea that the way I started every morning had been building a wall between me and heaven my whole life. Behind me, I heard bodies hitting the floor. Tariq was on his knees weeping. Faisal had his forehead pressed against a pew, shaking. Bassam was sitting against the wall with tears pouring silently down his face. Munir had fled through the side door. Walid was kneeling with his hands raised, trembling. The congregation had gone silent. Then slowly, one by one, they began to pray again. For us. The priest whose robe I had torn knelt beside me. He placed his old, trembling hand on my shoulder and said, "He loves you, son. He has been waiting for you. Do you understand now?" Ask yourself this question. How do you explain hearing the voice of the living God when everything you believed told you he could not speak? I looked at the priest through swollen eyes and whispered, "How do I follow him?" He helped me to my feet. He held both my hands in his, and right there, in front of the same people I had tried to terrorize, he led me in a prayer that rewrote my entire life. I said, "Jesus, I have been wrong about you. I have spent my life praying to a God I thought I knew, but I never knew you. I mocked your people. I silenced your worship, but you spoke to me anyway. Forgive me. Save me. I surrender everything." The church erupted with joy. People who had been kneeling in terror were now standing, clapping, weeping, rushing forward to embrace us. An old woman held my face in both her hands and said, "Welcome home." That night, 4 of the 5 men gave their lives to Jesus: Tariq, Faisal, Bassam, Walid. Munir returned 2 weeks later and surrendered as well. I was baptized 3 months later at St. Peter's Cathedral. I chose the name Elijah because Elijah was a man whose prayers unlocked heaven. And now I finally understood what that meant. The morning after my conversion, I called my father. I told him everything. The silence lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then his voice came through, cold as a stone. "You are no longer my son. You are dead to us. Do not call this number again." He hung up. My mother sent one message the next day. "How could you do this to us?" Then she blocked my number. Yasmin came to my apartment that evening. She placed the engagement ring on the kitchen counter without looking at me and said, "You are an apostate. I will pray that Allah guides you back or destroys you." She walked out and I never saw her again. Within 3 weeks, I was fired after my employer received pressure from local leaders. My landlord asked me to leave. Friends I had known since childhood held a janazah prayer for me at the mosque as though I had died. I received 9 death threats in the first month. I had no idea that following Jesus would cost me every earthly thing I had ever valued. I eventually fled Egypt for a small town in southern France, where a Christian organization helped me start over. I arrived with a single bag and a Bible. That is when it happened again. Not a vision. A quiet morning in a small room where I woke up, and for the first time in my life, the first words out of my mouth were not complaint. They were, "Jesus, you are enough." And I felt the barrier break. I felt heaven open, not with thunder, with warmth, with a presence so close I could have touched it. But I gained everything that truly matters: Jesus Christ, forgiveness, peace that did not depend on circumstances, and a new understanding of prayer that changed everything. It was in that French town that I met Claire. She was a Lebanese Christian woman working as a translator for the refugee ministry. She had dark eyes and a laugh that made every room warmer. I told her everything: the hatred, the attack, the vision, the truth about prayer. She did not flinch. We were married 7 months later at St. Peter's Cathedral in Mansoura, the same church I had stormed, the same altar where I collapsed. The old priest officiated with his torn robe mended and his hands still trembling with age. Tarek, Faisal, Bassam, and Walid stood beside me as groomsmen. Today I serve in ministry, teaching people, both Muslims and Christians, the truth Jesus showed me about prayer. I travel across the Middle East and Europe sharing my testimony. Over 100 people have transformed their prayer lives after hearing what Jesus revealed to me that night. But the message was never just for me. It was for every person who wakes up tomorrow morning and speaks death before they speak to God. I returned to St. Peter's last year and knelt on the exact spot where I collapsed. This time, the first words from my mouth were praise. I still send letters to my parents twice a year. I tell them I love them. I tell them about Claire and about our son Daniel, whose first morning words every day are, "Good morning, Jesus." No response has ever come, but I will never stop writing. Ask yourself this question: what would change in your life if the first words you spoke every morning were agreement with God instead of agreement with the enemy? The Muslim man who grabbed the priest by the robe and screamed that Christian prayers were lies no longer exists. In his place stands a follower of Jesus Christ who has learned that the most powerful prayer in the world begins not with a request, but with a declaration of who God is. If he can transform someone like me, someone who mocked his name, attacked his people, and spent 29 years praying to a wall he built with his own words, then he can absolutely transform you, no matter what you have done or where you come from. The same Jesus who stopped me in that church and showed me the one thing that blocks prayer is standing before you right now through this very testimony. He is offering you the same love, the same revelation, the same open heaven that changed everything for me. You do not need a vision. You do not need to storm a church. You just need tomorrow morning. Look inside your own heart right now. Jesus is calling you right now. When you wake up tomorrow and your feet touch the floor and your mouth opens to speak the first words of your day, will you let him in? And will those first words be an agreement with his goodness or a surrender to the enemy's lie that nothing will ever change?